In this lecture, we're going to look at market structure by examining some case studies, and then we're going to look at what happens when governments intervene in markets. If we look at the Harvard Business Review study of the University of Utah hospital system, we find someone saying, "I helped the University of Utah hospital system manage its drug budgets and medication use policies. Then in 2015, I got sticker shock. Our annual inpatient cost for a single drug skyrocketed from $300,000 to $1.9 million. That's because the drug maker, Valiant, suddenly increased the price of isoproterenol from $440 to roughly $2,700 a dose. Clearly, this is a case of monopoly pricing." Another case looked at drug patents that were expiring in 2020. Truvada, Gilead's HIV drug, pulled in $2.6 billion in the US last year. It lost revenues, of course, when new generics appeared in 2021. Drugs which are losing patent protection in 2020 have $8 billion in US sales based on 2019 dollars. The next graph in the next slide shows the extent that drug prices have come down when patients expire and generics enter. Notice the importance of competition by generic companies. Here we see that as the number of generic producers increases, the price just comes falling down to something that is more affordable and more reasonable in many events. It's not surprising, therefore, that these companies work very hard to try and protect their market against generics. Here we come across a difficult question when it comes to monopoly, and that is corporate social responsibility. Is your company responsible to its shareholders, to the board, to the administration, the president, vice president, and so on? Suppose that your company owns a patent on a drug which is used to treat a rare nervous system disorder in children. There are 3 remaining years on the patent. The profits that you've already made to date have been more than double your research and development costs, marketing costs, and production costs. The one competing drug is unexpectedly removed from the market. Your drug is currently priced at $450 per day. If you raise this price to $750 a day, your profits will increase by 30%. Would you raise the drug price or leave it as it is? That's an interesting question, and that is really beyond the ability of economists to address, and we should think in that terms in what we were discussing in the first lecture. Now consider a different type of monopolist where this kind of issue of social responsibility isn't quite as strong, but it can be important nonetheless. Google as a monopolist supplier of internet searching. Google has about 80% of the market share in internet searches. Network effects keep competitors from gaining market shares. Recall our discussion of the declining average cost curve. The more users in the network, the more valuable the network is to each individual user. So you see, most people like to use Google. I know I do. Google keeps track of what you are interested in, and this tracking would be much less effective if you were using a variety of search engines. Google then leverages its high user base into an advertising revenue. Google has 30% of online advertising revenue. It competes with Facebook, Microsoft, I'm not sure exactly what product they have there, YouTube, X, and others. Does it really have a monopoly in this market? And what about ChatGPT? Does it have a monopoly? Microsoft has Copilot, and Google has, of course, Google. You might want to discuss this, particularly in the context of the previous slide. Here is another interesting question. Privatization of drinking water has become common in many countries. In fact, in some countries, you wouldn't have drinking water of the quality that people desire and need, without privatization of the water, the drinking water that is. Does this constitute a monopoly? Well, it would seem so. If so, what can be done? What can you do? Can you run it as a utility? Can the government regulate this? Can you bring in competition? Those are all questions that are important to this kind of issue. So water privatization is controversial. Many cities around the world have privatized their drinking water. For example, Manila and Bucharest. Privatization can lead to large infrastructure investments and water quality improvements, and this is why countries do it. These improvements must be paid for with higher water tariffs. Many argue that water is a fundamental human right that should not be commodified like beer. This is especially true when natural monopolies are doing the pricing. Please spend a little bit of time to think about this and maybe discuss it with other students. Again, we have a contrast here that we had between the medical drug that saved children versus Google. Here we have privatization of water against accounting software. QuickBooks and TurboTax are both owned by Intuit. In 2019, Intuit had 90% retail market share in consumer tax software and employee firm management software. In the market for consumer tax software, Intuit must compete against free government tax websites. Intuit prices aggressively and maintains attractive features to capture a high market share. I know I use TurboTax, mainly because the government site is not nearly as easy to use. So does Intuit behave like a monopolist? If we look at Intuit share prices over the past 5 years, we see that they've gone up quite a bit. And a strengthening monopoly is characterized by earning increasing profits over time, and these increasing profits translate into increasing share price. But what goes up must come down, and the question here is that when I took the data that was Intuit up to here, we saw a rising increase in share prices, but then since then it has fallen again. Then the question is, was the initial rise a pandemic outcome with subsequent decline thereafter? You might want to consider that. So now we go back to the theory. Are monopolies easy to analyze? Well, all firms maximize profits by pricing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. At least that's the shibboleth of economics. The problem is that for most firms, marginal revenue depends on the pricing strategies of rival firms, and that's complicated to analyze. If we're in a perfect market, a perfectly competitive market, then marginal revenue simply equals price because no firm can impact the price by changing quantity. But when there's a few firms, then you run into a more complicated analysis, which we will look at a little later. A monopolist, however, has no rivals, and so marginal revenue can be calculated directly from the market demand curve. And it should then be easy to analyze because selling one more unit has two effects on revenue. It increases revenue because more is being sold, but it decreases revenue because the price must be lower for all units. It's the net of these two effects that determines if marginal revenue is positive or negative. So then we have to look at sources of market power. The discussion applies to all firms selling a differentiated product. The more elastic the demand is, the less market power a firm has. So think of a perfectly competitive firm where the demand function facing the firm is a horizontal line, a horizontal demand function that's completely elastic. Demand is more elastic the greater availability of substitute products. If there's more firms selling similar products, and the utility loss from not consuming the product is not large, for example, with cauliflower. Monopolies succeed only if competitors are kept out of the market. Entry can be prevented through laws, regulations such as patents or charters, or through cost considerations. That means that the average cost curve, the long run average cost curve, is downward sloping and the monopolist sits towards the lower end of that. In that case, cost is a most effective entry barrier because the fixed costs are large and mostly sunk. Imagine trying to start up a firm to compete with BC Hydro in the residential electricity market. Another example of a law or regulation acting as a barrier to entry is what the U.S. Softwood Lumber Coalition has been able to do. They've been able to lobby the American government to impose taxes on or tariffs on the entry of Canadian softwood lumber, thereby raising the price that they get. Now we can look at oligopoly, where we have several sellers that are not sufficiently large enough to behave as a monopolist, but together band together as if they could serve as a monopolist. The automobile industry is one, but it's currently in turmoil due to the emphasis on EVs, and any outcome might be possible depending on how governments decide on the retention of internal combustion engines, for example. So what are the cost advantages? Well, a monopoly or even oligopolists have economies of scale. The competitor must enter with very high quantity to ensure that the average cost is below price. Large capital requirements and sunk costs, like that in research and development in the pharmaceutical industry, make entry very risky. Other examples are oil exploration and refining. Pure quality and cost advantages. Example, the Intel chip for microprocessing chips. Network advantages. The Visa credit card has a network advantage. Sometimes you can't use any other credit card but Visa. Control of resources, as is the case with De Beers diamonds. And what I alluded to in a previous slide is the high fixed costs. Average total cost is still falling when demand is satisfied. In that case, you end up with a natural monopoly. As compared to multiple firms, one firm can supply the entire market at a low average cost. Railways and public utilities, gas and electric utilities, are good examples of regulated natural monopolies. But in some cases, even these are collapsing. Utilities such as BC Hydro are regulated by government, as are telephone companies, or at least they were up until the new revolution in mobile telephones. But that in itself is a good example of how technology can do away with monopoly. Natural monopolists also exist at a small scale. For example, a grocery shop in a small remote town. Monopolies don't necessarily earn high profits. It largely depends on the size of the fixed costs that they face. So let's look at the theory of natural monopoly. Average total cost is still declining at the point where demand is equal to average cost. So here we have a demand curve, and again we use a linear one. Here we have a declining average cost curve, an average total cost curve. Here's our marginal cost curve. The marginal cost curve, remember, will intersect the average cost curve when the average cost curve hits its minimum, and then the marginal cost curve comes up from below the average cost curve. So the marginal cost curve intersects the average cost from below, and we see here that that isn't happening yet. It could happen down in this area someplace. But here we have that declining average cost. So one firm can always expand output and lower that average cost, forcing the other firm to reduce output and raise average cost. So if two firms are supplying the market, the average cost would be up here. All right. But if one firm were to leave, or one firm gets an advantage over the other and can slide further down, it could drive the first one out, and the stable price would occur here, where the average cost of the one firm supplies Q star. So instead of two firms each supplying half of Q star, one does the trick, and the optimal price that the regulator should set is where the average cost is. Of course, the firm will try to act like a monopolist, construct a marginal revenue curve, and then price somewhere up here up until the point that entry again occurs. So the pricing probably won't be exactly like a monopoly price because the firm wants to keep out any competitors. So in that case, you'd probably have to price in this range somewhere. Okay, we're now going to look at government intervention, and we're going to look at two kinds of studies, two kinds of government intervention. One is price support to agriculture, and the other one is subsidies for electric vehicles. Okay, let's look at agricultural price support programs. So the government wishes to support the incomes of farmers, partly to protect them from the variability in income caused by generally weather conditions, but also for a variety of other reasons. To prevent the demise of rural communities, for example, to ensure domestic food production capacity, to earn foreign exchange through exports, protect the lifestyle. That's your motherhood and apple pie kind of argument. So when we look at this, so consider the following diagram. So here we have supply of cereal grains and the demand for cereal grains. Because of weather conditions, we get this Q moving back and forth because the supply curve is probably shifting back and forth. That causes the price to go up and down. All right. Whether the price goes really high or very low is questionable. There's a whole literature on stabilizing prices using storage as a mechanism for doing so, but we're not getting into that here. So now the government is going to support incomes by increasing the price, by supporting the price, by guaranteeing that the farmer is going to get so many dollars per metric ton or per bushel for grain. With that price support, the market is out of whack. So we have to consider some different possibilities. The government can support producers at PS and sell the output at PD to clear the market. So in other words, what happens is with this support price, this is how much Q1 is how much the farmers will produce, but Q0 is what is sold in the market. So the government can purchase all of the grain, Q1, and sell it at the price PD. In that case, this entire area is going to be the cost to the Treasury. All right, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, K. Area H constitutes the deadweight loss. I mentioned storage. So a second possibility is that the government supports producers at this price PS, sells what it can at that price, and stores the commodity indefinitely. So it's able to sell this amount, Q0, production is Q1, and this difference Q1, Q0 is what the government is going to store. So the cost to the Treasury is D plus E plus F, G, H, K, M, and N. Now, is that more or less than the bigger area here? Pardon me, I shouldn't have said bigger. Okay, this area here was what it cost under option 1 in the previous slide. This is the cost under option 2, where we have some storage. The problem is that this isn't sustainable, as indicated by several years of this attempt by the EU and a variant of this by the US, because you're building up stocks of the grains, and in the EU and US cases what you did was you dumped it onto the international market, lowering the prices that poor countries receive for their own grains. So then the third possibility is that the government supports producers at this price here. Q1 is produced, Q0 is sold at the domestic price of PD equals to PS, which leaves this surplus, which is then sold at the world price of PW. All right. Notice here that we don't show the world demand function. That will come in another lecture. The consumers pay this amount. They lose this amount because they have to pay this domestic price as opposed to the world price for that commodity. And the country is subject to charges under WTO rules of dumping the commodity. Now, this has been a huge problem in the case of the US, EU, and even for Canada and other countries, which we will discuss in later lectures. Here is a kind of hybrid option where, again, the government supports producers at this price PS. Q1 is produced. Q0 greater than Q star is sold domestically at the world price. So in other words, the consumers now benefit to a certain degree, depending on, because they want this amount, now they're going to get this amount, they get GBKA. The remainder, Q1 minus Q0, is exported at the world price, and the cost to the Treasury is now A plus B plus G, HO, H1, and K. So this is the cost to the Treasury. It's higher than in case 3 by area A in the previous slide, but domestic producers gain this area HOGA as producer surplus, okay, as quasi-rent. Now this is another alternative that governments can use, and that is supply restrictions. This is the case of Canada in the dairy industry, for example, which we looked at. So the new supply curve is now SR. So the dark, thick line is the new supply curve. So we've cut off this part of the supply curve. We've forced producers to produce QR rather than Q star under under competitive conditions, or with a price of PS. We would like, or producers would like to produce Q1. So farmers would like to produce Q1, but they have to produce QR. So less is produced. Producers still get that support price, which is also the price consumers pay, and the producer cost is P prime. So they they earn basically this area A, B. The income transfer is equal to the quota rent, A plus B. The deadweight loss is D plus E, which may be less than H, depending on the elasticities of supply and demand. The problem is that you can't export. You have an import restriction that's required. Scarcity or quota rent eventually gets capitalized into a factor of production, thus increasing cost to producers. And that is exactly what has happened in Canada's dairy sector. The question is, suppose we were to remove this kind of a regime, could Canada compete on the world market and thereby, even at the world price, expand and earn more income compared to what it could earn under a quota regime? So this is a unique situation, and about the only country who maintains this kind of a system is Canada in the dairy sector. Agricultural economics is so interesting because there are so many other ways to support producer incomes using price manipulation. Prices to producers can be tiered. For example, the US used a tier system, a low price to prevent producers from planning high production levels, but eventually supporting output at a higher price depending on yields. Prices paid by domestic consumers could be tiered. Support levels are tied to various compliance measures. For example, you have to reduce your area in crop production by some percentage below an average of previous years in order to qualify for payments. You can set aside a percentage of your total cropland as a conservation reserve and get paid for a conservation reserve. Now, these are called cross-compliance measures, and there are a whole host of these things that deal with environmental issues such as wetlands protection, soil erosion prevention or conservation of land, and even now into the whole business of carbon. Okay, let's consider the subsidies for electric vehicles and the predicament that this might cause. So here we have a demand function for electric vehicles and a supply function. In a competitive market, what we would find is that the automobile manufacturers would supply Q star at a price of P star, and the market would equilibrate at point E. The government wishes more vehicles to be produced. Let's say they wish QS amount of vehicles to be produced and sold. Now, you think of this Q star as being over here quite a bit and this QS quite a bit to the right of it. In order to get QS, the government provides a subsidy of S per vehicle. We won't get into detail about different types of vehicles and different kinds of subsidies. Just assume a subsidy of S per vehicle, and this is the number of electric vehicles. The subsidy is given by this red double-headed arrow, and the benefit or the amount of subsidy that the government has to pay, what the cost is to the Treasury, is given by P star, PS, and M. So this rectangle. Now the problem is the price that the automobile manufacturers face is P star, so they will produce at E amount Q star. So there's a shortfall given by QS minus Q star, this amount EM. So what is needed is the government might mandate manufacturers to satisfy demand, in which case they will raise prices of other vehicles such as gasoline pickups and SUVs to subsidize mandated EV targets internally. Alternatively, and this is probably what is required and some of which is going to occur or does occur, the government can subsidize EV production by subsidizing the automobile manufacturers directly. Or it can do a bit of both. So the consumer subsidy, as I pointed out, is this rectangle here, and it's equal to S times Q of S, that little S per vehicle times number of vehicles. The producer subsidy, whether that comes from internally or from government, is given by C P star MK. And that's the total cost, or that could be the total cost to the Treasury. Of course, the deadweight loss is KEN. That's the deadweight loss to society. Now, suppose that government subsidies and all of the social media hype and everything else induces a change in attitude towards greater demand of EVs. Now, instead of the government's target being QS, its target is QS2. So instead of increasing electric vehicle purchases from Q star to QS, it increases them from Q star to QS2. So the demand curve is shifted from D to DS. And if we work through this, the subsidy will also have increased. Again, the government will need to increase its subsidy to buyers and, importantly, to manufacturers if they are to produce the desired level of EVs that buyers demand at PS2. So look at this. If we go to QS, initially we have that E is where supply and demand intersect, but now the demand and supply intersect at this point here where the demand is shifted out. So now we're looking at needing to provide a bit larger subsidy to get there, and you'll notice that we are shifting to a greater extent the amount of this distance QS2 minus Q star is greater than QS Q star. So what's happened is the government will need to increase its subsidy to buyers and, importantly, to manufacturers if they are to produce the desired level of electric vehicles that buyers demand at PS2. Mandating production of QS2 or higher target will require firms to transfer the costs onto other products via higher prices. Higher prices for pickups and SUVs will reduce sales as required, but also reduces companies' ability to subsidize EV production. So what are we finding? Well, we're finding that the government subsidies and the changes in attitudes have resulted in a shortfall in EV production. However, in some countries, because of renewable energy targets in electricity, the electricity prices have gone up, and because of some people's problems with electric vehicles, for example, electric vehicles catching fire, the demand has also shifted inward, in which case in some countries, particularly the UK, we see that there's a surplus of electric vehicles. So on the one hand, our economics is telling us that we're going to have a shortage, but on the other hand, some of the other developments related to EVs suggest that there may even be surpluses in some cases.